Mr. Risher.
Mr. President, have you been surprised by the intensity of the protest against your decision to send troops into Cambodia? And will these protests affect your policy in any way?
No, I have not been surprised by the intensity of the protest. I realize that those who are protesting believe that this decision will expand the war, increase American casualties, and increase American involvement. And those who protest want peace. They want to reduce American casualties, and they want our boys brought home. I made the decision, however, for the very reasons that they are protesting. And as far as affecting my decision is concerned, their protests I am concerned about. I am concerned because I know how deeply they feel. But I know that what I have done will accomplish the goals that they want. It will shorten this war. It will reduce American casualties. It will allow us to go forward with our withdrawal program. The 150,000 Americans that I announced for withdrawal the next year will come home on schedule. And it will, in my opinion, serve the cause of a just peace in Vietnam.
That was President Nixon on May 8th, 1970, addressing protests against the war in Vietnam. Good evening and welcome to the Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm your host, Mary Kissel. Thank you for tuning in. Tonight, we're joined by co-chairs Ambassador Robert O'Brien and Secretary Mike Pompeo and our distinguished seminar members. Our topic, the impact of foreign policy on American politics, a feature of the Nixon presidency and many after, including the current occupant of the White House. So welcome to you all. Secretary Pompeo, I'd like you to kick us off. The received wisdom is that Americans don't vote on foreign policy. There's really no link between our domestic politics and our national security. But is that really true?
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening to all the folks watching. Mary, I hope you're doing well. I think you see this polling and it never rises to number one or number two, except in very intense moments. But if it is not decision making, it provides the mood music for sure. And I think that's what President Nixon was addressing there as well. We need to look back all the way to the 1970s. You can look at what's taking place today, where President Biden is deeply attuned to the domestic implications of what's taking place in the Middle East and in Europe. That certainly was true in the Trump administration as well. We talked about putting America first. In the end, that is a model of how it is you think about the American people and how they're secured, both abroad and at home, in the context of national security. And so I often hear these things talked about, and it's framed this evening as two separate fields. But there's enormous overlap, whether it's energy or diplomacy or cyber issues. The overlap between these issues, the national security we think about abroad and the domestic security we think about at home, they are inseparable. And there's no political actor, no member of Congress, no president of the United States that doesn't think about what are the domestic political ramifications of my foreign policy decisions. Because in fact, you do need, in the end, you need American support for hard decisions on national security issues.
Ambassador O'Brien, thanks for being with us tonight. Do you agree with Secretary Pompeo? What would you add?
I always agree with Mike. So that's ask that question. But I just came back from Columbia, so I got a little perspective on this. So I was at Columbia University working on talking about hostages and bringing American hostages home. And people are forgetting that Hamas still holds American hostages. And we're treating Hamas, the U.S. government's treating Hamas like they're some sort of NGO or some sort of legitimate government, while they hold Americans hostage. And we don't see the outpouring of support for these Americans, maybe because they're Jewish, because that we're seeing for Evan Gershkovich and other hostages that are held around the world, in Iran and Afghanistan. But I then had the opportunity to meet with the American Jewish students who are at Columbia, and they're terrified. They're being chased to their homes. They're not allowed on campus. They're being called the most vile names imaginable. And all this is giving support and empathy and buoying up our adversary, Hamas, which is a terrorist organization as bad as anything that we ever saw with ISIS or Al Qaeda. The October 7th attacks on Israel were like something we saw out of the al-Baghdadi handbook. And instead of Americans rallying to our Jewish friends and supporting them and supporting Israel, we've got people on college campuses. A lot of them are outside agitators, but some students shutting down college campuses in support of a terrorist organization. We've never seen this in America before. It's un-American, and it's not that they're supporting Hamas and calling for the destruction of Israel. They're chanting death to America. And that's very different than the protesters that President Nixon talked about. He understood they wanted to bring American boys home so they didn't get killed in the rice paddies of Vietnam. They wanted peace. These protesters today don't want peace. They want the destruction of one of our great allies, and they want to harass and send Jewish Israelis back to Poland. I mean, that didn't work out well the first time. So it's really a shame that we're seeing an administration today. The president made some nice comments on Holocaust Memorial Day, as he should. But we've seen an administration that's been utterly indifferent to the protesters and the Jewish students on campus, and has been utterly indifferent to our ally Israel. And that's a shame. But you see the linkage between the Biden administration's desire to gain 100,000 votes in Michigan and trying to placate the worst of the impulses of the American electorate and the damage it's doing to our reputation overseas and home.
Well, I guess the benefit of our system is that if those instincts do move against the wishes of the American voter, they are corrected usually in the next election. We've got Representative Mike Waltz here, the expert on the goings-on in Capitol Hill. Mike, how do you see our foreign policy toward Israel, since we're discussing Israel, although we could discuss, other issues like Ukraine as regards the Biden presidency, where this is a problem. How do you see that policy being shaped by domestic politics today?
Well, look, I'll just tell you this, Mary, and Secretary Pompeo, I think, can appreciate this as well, in having to turn out votes. And when you have over 100,000 Michigan Democrats in the dead of winter make a point to drive after work in a primary that is already preordained for President Biden with no real opposition, and they still make a point to get out to the polls and those kinds of numbers to register a protest vote. If that didn't set off every alarm bell in the president's political operation, I don't know what does. So, it's look, this can be mutually reinforcing or mutually damning either way. But I think Secretary Pompeo said it well, in that it often provides the backdrop. It's not just the backdrop in whether people feel safe, whether people feel secure, whether there's a general level of anxiety, which we're actually seeing in polling now with the state of the world, and with under President Biden's leadership, or lack thereof, frankly. It also provides kind of a backdrop and mood music for general perceptions of the president as commander-in-chief. And commander-in-chief is perhaps the most important duty in Article 2 of the Constitution. So, when people are kind of evaluating just on a visceral and I think on an emotional level, a leader, and when they see that leader either stumble on the world stage or excel on the world stage, all Americans either rally behind that leader or they start thinking we need a new leader. So I think while it may not register as a top 1 or 2, 3 issue specifically, I do think it absolutely sets the backdrop, not only for how people feel and in a secure, are you more secure or less secure question is absolutely critical, but it's also the backdrop for just how they view the commander-in-chief.
It's a great point, and I want to bring in Alex Wong. Alex, leaders, of course, don't have to follow the popular mood. President Biden could have simply continued his strong stance supporting Israel. But then these college protests did erupt all over the country, although largely in the coastal areas, big cities as well. So, why is it that he chose to try to, go down the middle, which doesn't seem to be working for him?
Yeah, I have to be honest. I'm a little baffled by what the Biden campaign is seeing in their polling or in their analysis, or what advice he's getting from his strategists on trying to straddle between, on one hand, his initial very strong support for Israel in the wake of October 7th, and now what we're seeing is, to put it, bluntly, pandering to an extreme wing of his party. I don't know what he's seeing in the polling. But I think it's a mistake. One, you're not going to satisfy from his position, you satisfy either side with this position, and it exudes weakness. It exudes lack of leadership, and it also happens to be the wrong policy, letting his domestic political concerns drive his foreign policy. And overall, to the overall general election population, when they see irresoluteness, when they see indecision, that is another piece of evidence that, despite being the current commander-in-chief, President Biden is failing the quote-unquote commander-in-chief test. And when you're running for president, that's the test that you have to pass. Now, you've mentioned, Mary, that the conventional wisdom is kitchen table issues, economic issues, domestic issues are how you win an election. But the corollary to that is on foreign policy. If you don't pass the commander-in-chief test, you can lose an election on that. And what I see right now is, and if you look at the data on President Biden's polling and the confidence that the American people have in his presidency, it really started going downhill with the botched Afghanistan withdrawal. That was an event that made them lose confidence that this is a strong leader on the international stage. And he's never really recovered from that. And I think he's compounding that with this Israel policy.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Michael Dukakis in the tank with the funny helmet on when you say passing the leadership test. It's a great point, Alex. Secretary Pompeo, President Nixon talked at length about his policy toward Israel, and talked specifically about how American Jews believe that, by putting Israel first, it doesn't mean you're putting America second. These two things are really linked together. But he also said, on occasion, an American president must make a decision, and I'm quoting him here, that doesn't give the Israelis a blank check. Like, for instance, he pursued warmer relations with Egypt. Is there something today, was there another strategy that President Biden could have employed here that, didn't give the Israelis a blank check, but somehow didn't go to the extreme of, effectively tacitly supporting these college protests? I think you're on mute, sir.
I don't think anybody is advocating for a blank check for anyone. I think there are a set of strategic objectives that are in America's best interest. Let's start with getting the American hostages home, just as a baseline. But second, the pushback to make sure that the evil guys don't win and the good guys do is important in its own right. The fact that the Iranians are behind each of these problem sets, whether it's what's taking place in Gaza and Rafah as we sit here tonight, or what's taking place in the north of Israel, where we still have over 100,000 Israelis that can't go back to their homes. These are the kind of things that I think the American people can suss them out. They may not be following it as deeply as each of us does and every twist and turn, but they can get a real sense of this. And I think, Mary, this really gets to the conversation this evening. Presidents have an obligation to make arguments. That is, you can't go and do anything with a national security issue, whether that's export control policy on technology being sold to China, or efforts to make sure that Maduro doesn't go take over Guyana. You can't do those things without explaining to the American people it's going to cost money. It's real money. It's not cheap. Taxpayer dollars. We believe underwriting this. We think using American taxpayer money to achieve this objective is in the American national interest, and articulating the overlap between why it matters to someone in my home state. I represent Wichita, Kansas. Why it matters to a family on a farm in South Central Kansas. Why it matters to someone in an urban environment in Chicago. You have to articulate the rationale. And I think, others have alluded to this. I think one of the failures that President Biden has had is I think it was 7 months in before he actually spoke to the American people about Ukraine at all, and over a year and a half in before he went to the Oval Office and articulated a rationale for American support against the aggression of Vladimir Putin. The American people deserve better. And so that overlap between the things you're doing outside of the country and the impact it has on every American citizen has to be explained, articulated. And when it is, I think presidents can get the space they need to do what they know is the right thing for America. And I think good leaders will have the American people following them. I watch, one last thought here. I watch the recruiting challenges we're having today in the military, and it breaks my heart, but it's explainable. When you aren't defending merit inside of the military, when you are talking about climate change as the central thesis of our armed forces, when you are making a set of things that have no relevance to the capacity to go kill people and break things, to people who are thinking about showing up at a recruiting station, the American people, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that provide this security will say, I think I'll go do something different. And so that is as personal and as domestic as you can get, sending one of your family members to join the United States Armed Forces. And when you get that wrong, when you break that machine, you create an enormous amount of risk. And I think President Biden is suffering from that greatly today. And I know that our military is.
Yeah, and you contrast that, for instance, with President Reagan's constant speeches about the evil empire of the Soviet Union and why it was in our interest to win and to have us win and to have them lose. Or President George W. Bush talking about Iraq and Afghanistan in hindsight, probably mistakes in the way that we went in and how long that we stayed. But he valiantly tried to make the argument it's better to fight him over there than to fight him over here. Ambassador O'Brien, are there other examples of presidents who have done a good job explaining, the interests of U.S. national security to that domestic audience, to the American voter?
Well, certainly Ronald Reagan is the paradigm in that front, Mary. And let me just go back to this current situation with Israel. When Leon Klinghoffer, the American wheelchair-bound Jewish tourist, was thrown off the Achille Lauro cruise ship, Ronald Reagan said to the terrorists, "You can run, but you can't hide." And we actually sent up F-14 Tomcats. We intercepted the terrorists. We found them, forced them down to Italy. The Italians eventually let them go. That's a different story. But Ronald Reagan pursued the terrorists at every turn. Where is that today? Where are we? We had 30 Americans killed, butchered on October 7th. We have another half dozen Americans held hostage. Why isn't Delta Force, why, like we did in the Trump administration, why aren't the Navy SEALs trying to rescue those Americans? Why are they sitting on the sidelines? Why are we treating Hamas like it's some sort of non-governmental organization or the Red Cross or some humanitarian organization providing relief in Gaza rather than the terrorists that they are? And so Ronald Reagan said something that the American people instinctively understood. We're the good guys. We're the shining city on the hill. And they're bad actors out there. And we're going to try and do the best we can to show the bad actors that we're tough, we're strong, and that's how we're going to be peace. But we're also going to do something. We're going to be a beacon of hope. And that's for all the oppressed Chinese who aren't members of the thuggish Chinese Communist Party, for all the Russians who hate Putin and hope for a better future, for the Iranians that would like to have real democracy and would like to realize the wealth of their country. They should be able to look to America and see hope. And it may not come immediately, but know that there's something better out there for them, that the humanity has the light of humanity and freedom and democracy that's beaming from our shores. And they don't see that today. They see political prosecutions. They see, which, look as bad as any show trial that we've ever seen with Stalin. They see these terrorists taking over college campuses, wrapping masks around their face and dressing like Palestinian terrorists on domestic soil. They see our border wide open and bad actors coming over the border, 30,000 Chinese military-age males coming over in the last year. And we don't look like a shining city on the hill. So presidential leadership, whether those things are popular, opening the borders is popular with the far left, or unrestricted immigration from countries where people hate us is popular with the far left, or these college campuses that their poor kids are being radicalized and stirred up by these outside agitators. If that's popular with the far left, Ilhan Omar and the Squad and that sort of thing, whether these political prosecutions of the former president, which make us look like ancient Rome, which is out of the lost republic, with these sorts of prosecutions, and that may all be good for Democrat politics, but it's not good for America. And it's time that President Biden start thinking about what's good for America and what's good for people who yearn for freedom across the world, and not just worry about staying in power. Sometimes there are things more important than staying in power. And returning America to the real values that we uphold is the most important thing we can do. And I hope the Biden administration goes back to peace with strength. I hope they stop pandering to the weirdo far left on their left flank of their party to try and secure an election victory, and start promoting America the way it should be.
Mike Waltz, I hate to be cynical here, but has something changed in this younger generation? I think it was Secretary Pompeo earlier that contrasted the anti-war protests in the 60s versus these protests today. Understandable to want to get American men home, but today to be protesting on behalf of terrorists and against American interests. I mean, has something fundamentally changed about the voting public? Is that what the president is reacting to, or is that too cynical? Is that a fringe? What say you?
Well, no, I do think something has changed, and we've realized now 50 years of what the progressives have called the long march through the institutions, starting with, if you read, Chris Rufo's account of it, America's Cultural Revolution, how the left has taken over everything, and where he really articulates how a series of groups, the Weather Underground, neo-Marxist, the violent environmentalists, the black nationalists, they got tired of getting put in jail for their violent actions against American society. So they came together in the late 60s, early 70s and said, well, let's start the long march through the institutions, starting with academia and then the entertainment industry and then media and then the sports industry. And the holy grail for Marxists would be corporate boards through ESG and the American military through critical race theory. So I do think it's a culmination of literally decades of acolytes of Angela Davis and David Ayers, the founder of the 1619 Project being one of them. And at the end of the day, people asked me, why is Biden's policy so bad? And I think you have a witch's brew of two things. One, a base of his party that literally believes this America is not a force for good, that we're inherently misogynist, racist, colonialist, and patriarchal. And then you couple that with an appeasement first, concessions first approach, where Biden's surrounded by a group of academics that many of us know well, and maybe nice guys and gals, but don't have a lot of dirt under their fingernails in terms of how the world really works, particularly in the Middle East. And I think we are where we are. And I just wanted to, Mary, if I could just say one more thing. I think Alex nailed it, in that Biden ran on being compassionate and competent. And the Afghanistan withdrawal completely pulled the rug out from under it. And it is one thing, as Secretary Pompeo rightly said, to not make the case to the American people and waited, it was actually nearly 2 years to have an Oval Office address to make the case on Ukraine. But it is another thing, and this is my point, to actually get in front of the American people and mislead them and lie to them, or pretend they just don't see. Well, when you stand before the American people and say the Afghanistan withdrawal was an outstanding success, when you stand before them and say, well, it's probably only about 100 Americans, when a whole multitude of veterans groups were saying it's far more, when you say the Taliban is not taking any kind of retribution on our allies, and we can see quite differently. I mean, it just went on and on. I mean, it was literally, don't believe my lying eyes. Meanwhile, you're just watching those horrific images on the screen. So was it incompetence? And then we can probably spend another half an hour on the lead up to Ukraine, the comments on minor incursions, the comments, the lifting of sanctions on Nord Stream, the basically telling our enemies what we're not going to do, the refusal to give the Ukrainians what they need to win up front, the appeasement and allowing Putin to deter us with his saber rattling. I mean, look, I think Secretary Pompeo and and the ambassador absolutely right. People don't follow the ins and outs, but they have a gut instinct for what strength looks like, and they have a gut instinct for someone who's just spinning them. And that is, I think, has been horrifically damaging for Biden. And his poll numbers have never recovered since the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Well, Alex Wong, to Mike's point, before you were negotiating with the North Koreans, you worked on a domestic political campaign, a presidential campaign. I mean, doesn't this all create an opening in a democracy like ours for somebody else to come along and give a different strategy here, win the hearts and minds of the voters?
Well, I think definitely, and it's it's an interesting race we have right now. We have two candidates who have both been president. So theoretically, they should both pass the commander-in-chief test. But the recent actions, as Congressman Waltz laid out by President Biden on the world stage, has created some doubt in the general electorate. And then you have someone who automatically passes the commander-in-chief test in President Trump, who's been there before, who's had significant achievements on the world stage from the Abraham Accords on down to make a case. But if I were to give any advice to President Trump, and it doesn't really need it from me, is to lay out a vision on foreign policy. Now, it doesn't have to be detailed. It doesn't have to get down into the weeds that the American people may not be so attuned to. But the key here is not simply that he needs to lay that out to win the election, but it gives him a strong mandate going into January, one that he will need, particularly if the Congress is divided, in order to make the bold policy actions in our competition with China, in putting Iran back into a box, in coming to a strong resolution in Ukraine. These are that kind of political mandate. If he lays that in the campaign, will put the wind at his back if and when he assumes office in January.
Well, it is going to be fascinating to see how foreign policy does impact the elections, not only for president, but in some of the swing states. You see, for instance, immigration policy is now very, very high up on voters' preference list when they're asked, what's important to you when you go to the polls. Ambassador O'Brien, on that, when was the last time that we had a world in this much chaos and disorder where foreign policy was being discussed, not just far away shores, but on our southern border?
Well, certainly in 1980, the Russians were on the move. They'd taken Angola and Nicaragua and were in El Salvador in a big way, all over Africa and Asia. But I was asked a similar question on one of the Sunday shows recently, and the anchor asked, Tony Blinken said this is the worst the Middle East has been since 1973. I said, I think this is the worst the world's been since 1938. I think we're in a real dangerous period. We have an axis of powers that are significant real powers with Iran, Russia, and China. They have different goals and different national interests, but they're united in the common desire to displace the United States as a leading power in the world. And they're taking action across the board. The Chinese are relentless. They operate in every domain, every continent, every kind of competition, whether it's tech or defense or political that there is. The Russians have actually invaded their neighbor and are trying to reassemble the Russian Empire. The Iranians have attacked Israel for the first time from their own territory. They're going to use their proxies to attack Israel on October 7th. So, and China is getting ready. I mean, everyone says, including the commanders of the Pacific Fleet, Indo-PACOM, that China is getting very close to being ready to force Taiwan into an unwanted reunification with the mainland. And so this is a very dangerous time for us. Meanwhile, our industrial base is wasting away. It's in very bad shape. Mike Waltz and Mike Pompeo both talked about the recruiting mess. I have both my daughters are serving in the military. One's a pilot, one's a JAG officer in the Army, and I worry about them. They're not getting the platforms they need, and the recruiting is we don't see recruiting commercials like we used to, like the Army of One and guys and gals coming over berms and tanks. Mike Pompeo used to drive, and special forces repelling out of helicopters like Waltz did. Now we see stories about a girl having two mommies and wanting to join the army, which is fine. I mean, nothing wrong with having two mommies, but that's not a recruiting ad for the army that's going to get young high school football players and basketball players and baseball players, who are aggressive and can stand up to these thugs and dictators and their minions. That's not going to get those guys motivated. It's not like Red Dawn and Top Gun to get people out motivated to defend their country. So, instead and I love what Tunnels to Towers do, but we've seen endless commercials on Fox of wounded veterans, and God bless them, and we all support them. That looks like the fruit of military service. And the other thing is we don't win. I still think there are a lot of Americans who want to win. A lot of American young men and young women who play sports and the type of kids that go into the military that want to win their games and not just get a participation trophy. But we're not winning. We're getting our butts kicked in places like Afghanistan by third-rate militias. And so until we start winning, and that's our ethos again in the military, and not climate change and trans rights, we're not going to recruit the men and women we need to fight our wars. So we've got a lot of work to do to get back to where we need to be to defend this country and defend our allies and partners.
Again, it comes back to Alex Wong's point about leadership and can you assume the mantle of commander-in-chief? We certainly have the means to do things like support Israel and give them everything that they need. I mean, they're very capable intelligence-wise with the IDF and their other capabilities. They're very capable, but we could have helped Ukraine win very quickly. But we just chose not to do so. And so, Secretary Pompeo, what has happened to leadership there in the political class? Because you used to have Democrats who were strong on defense. It wasn't just the Republicans that preached peace through strength. You had Democrats on the other side who agreed. Does that still exist today?
Yeah, it's there, but it's very muted. But you actually see this in both parties. So look, the conservative movement has always had an element that was more isolationist, right? It's always been there. Whether it was Ron Paul or we've had Pat Buchanan who almost made a run successfully for president, right? It's always been there. But in the end, I think the vast majority of the American people understand that's deeply, deeply dangerous. But it requires the leadership to articulate the vision for what these costs are really about, why it is that the benefit of America's global leadership, why it is that being that indispensable nation, it accrues enormous benefits to every American. We sometimes count the costs and forget to count the staggering benefits of the fact that the world trades in the U.S. dollar, that it is the case that everybody wants to come and be part of America. There aren't a million people trying to bust across the Russian southern border or the Chinese southern border today. These things matter. They matter to our economy. They matter to our families. But it does take American leadership. I was reminded when Representative Walsh was speaking, sometimes I think it feels improper to think about domestic issues when you're talking about important national security. It's like it's almost indecent or we can't talk about this connection. Let me assure you, there is not a leader in the world, whether they are leading a democracy or an authoritarian regime, that isn't thinking about how their decisions abroad are impacting their popularity at home. And I mean that in the broadest sense of popularity. How is it that the people of their nation are interpreting their leadership? That's true in the Middle East, right? We think about the fears of the Palestinian street rising in the Gulf Arab states, right? We're about to approach June 4th. Chinese uprisings of the people. I promise you, Xi Jinping is thinking about June 4th as he goes to bed tonight. He's thinking about, are we going to see what's happening on American campuses happening here? And he is damn determined to make sure it does not happen there. And he will use repressive means to achieve that. And so it is wholly appropriate for leaders to think about what's in the best interest of my country. And that has a deep connection to domestic issues. Mary, I was writing them down as we were ticking through them tonight. I remember when we were working on the challenge of illegal migration in our time, there was a deep domestic component to that for us and for the president of Mexico, who would usually respond by saying, I just can't do that because I can't get reelected, right? So it wasn't about, I can't do that because it's not in the best interest of the Mexican people. It was that will crush me if I put Mexican forces on the edge of your southern border. when we spoke to now Chancellor Scholz, when he was the finance minister in Germany, we were talking about Nord Stream 2. And his first response wasn't, gosh, it would be a really good thing if we stopped paying the Russians. It was, oh, my goodness, the cost of gas to heat the homes in Germany will rise and Chancellor Merkel will get, and her party will get crushed. Every world leader thinks about what is the ultimate, and properly so, thinks about the impact on their own people, and to try and disconnect those somehow, but is both improper, and it sells short the people of the country who are owed that explanation and the justification for why it is the case that a nation is making the choices internationally, whether it's to help their friends and partners or more directly to help their own nation.
Well, and to that point, Ambassador O'Brien, President Nixon talked about his outreach to Egypt in the lens of, hey, I want the United States there friendly with Cairo because I don't want the Soviet Union coming in and stepping into the breach. And it strikes me that we're in a very similar situation today. If we abandon Ukraine, Putin steps into the breach. We abandon Taiwan. We've already abandoned, for instance, nations like Cambodia, Laos and others where China's already stepped into that breach. I mean, that strikes me as a pretty important part of the argument.
Yeah, it's happened in Africa as well, Mary. The whole Sahel, Secretary Pompeo and I worked very hard to bring those countries in West Africa who are facing insurgencies and terrorism from a group called JNIM, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Nigeria. All those countries are now kicking America out where we had bases, and we're dealing with terrorist threats and hostage recoveries and pushing the Chinese out. The Chinese and Russians have now taken those countries over, and we're evacuating those countries. Now, why is that important? It's important because it gives the terrorists a place to regroup and operate. But many of those countries contain minerals that we're going to need for our new economy for the future, for lithium and rare earths and oil and gas. And we're surrendering those because we're not fighting for democracy, and we're not fighting for our allies and friends, and we're surrendering those places, those kind of vast spaces to the Russians and Chinese, which in the long run is going to be very to the Russian and Chinese benefit, and it's going to be to our detriment in a big way. So it's not just in Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel where we're failing the test. We're failing the test in Latin America. We're failing the test in Africa and Southeast Asia. When America doesn't lead, our adversaries have an opportunity. Our weakness is provocative to our adversaries, and they take advantage of that gap that's left. And ultimately, that's going to be bad, not just for us from a national security standpoint, but from an economic standpoint as well.
Alex Wong, are we lulled into complacency because these are places that are far away, and so we look at the campus protests and we think, okay, it's a expression that I might find disgusting, but it doesn't really impact me because that's somewhere else, somewhere halfway around the world.
Well, I think quite the opposite. I think the attention and the nerve that these protests have struck with the American people, which I don't think it's actually driven by media attention. I think the attention of the American people drove the media attention to it. I think the media tried not to cover these protests and cover the underlying issues driving them both domestically and internationally. But I will also say I think the American people were very keyed in going back to the Afghanistan withdrawal, but also on the wider growing competition we have with China. That's a conversation that's ongoing, not just in Washington as the capital, not just on Wall Street and businesses that will be affected by the economic and technological aspect of the competition. But this is something that I think the American people are turning to. So as a corollary, you had mentioned at the beginning of this, Mary, that the conventional wisdom was, domestic politics, kitchen table issues. That dominates politics. That dominates particularly presidential elections. But that, I think, is really an artifact of the post-Cold War period, that conventional wisdom. If you look at the elections of President Nixon, the namesake of this seminar, if you look at the presidency of Gerald Ford, if you look at Carter, if you look certainly at Reagan, the dominant issue of the time was which president, which party, who had the policies and the mettle and the approach that would win us the Cold War. And as we move into or are in the midst of a new Cold War, perhaps we're heading into a period where that, again, will be the dominant question or at least the one that hangs over and guides the choice of the American people in the selection of presidents and other elected officials.
Well, Congressman Waltz, you're up for election every couple of years. What do you hear when you go home to your district?
Every other year, Mary. I mean, we're either running, getting ready to run, or just got finished running. You're
really running every year.
The people's house is closest to the will of the people, that's for sure. But to that point, and I've made this to both my Republican and Democrat friends alike, our constituent, particularly on the issue of Ukraine, our constituents don't look at these issues in isolation or through a soda straw like Washington, D.C. tends to do and dives down into the weeds and the merits. They're looking at it in the context of their lives. And I can tell you, and I can't tell you how many think tankers in Washington I've invited to come to one of my town halls in Ocala, Florida. And it'd be a real wake-up call for them. These people are paying more than they ever have for eggs and basic foodstuffs. Insurance costs are rising through the roof. They can only fill half a tank of gas. They used to, for the same amount of money, just a few years ago, they had a full tank. Most people are week to week, paycheck to paycheck. And in the context of that, the context of every time they turn on the news, they see the southern border completely out of control. They turn on the news, and as Ambassador O'Brien was saying, they see our military not getting what it deserves or deteriorating, or veterans not getting what they deserve. And then in the midst of that, they say, wait a minute, you're going to send how many more billions to Ukraine? To what end? What are we accomplishing? And they also have, I think, longer memories than people give them credit for. I mean, they're thinking about it in the context of 20 years of policy drift in the Middle East, and say, are we heading in that direction again? I mean, they ask these questions, and when you have a president who didn't make the case, and back to domestic politics, you want the people on the other side of the aisle to make the case for him in an election year. That's a pretty tall order. And then I just want to address one other thing that I think Alex rightly raised, in that for President Trump coming in to really, and for everyone who has worked with him and is cheering him on to get back into the White House, to really articulate that vision. Because if you don't, the other side tries to. And America first does not mean America alone, but it does mean a matter of priorities. And he will prioritize the homeland. That is the ultimate priority. I remember the foreign policy establishment really kind of clutching their pearls at the thought of going after the cartels. Well, there's actually a long history of taking out and taking down networks and cartels, and Plan Colombia in the 90s and 2000s. That's not an unconventional idea. I also remember them laughing and making their jokes about the Space Force. Well, now we see with what's going on that it absolutely was the right idea. But, I think America first will prioritize the homeland, could prioritize a new Monroe Doctrine, where we have the energy, the minerals, the food supplies, the relationships in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the outcroppings, I think, of COVID was a real, very retail, at the voter level appreciation of supply chains and being able to get the stuff that you need. And then I think finally, we can have friends and allies, but we can hold them to account. We can have tough conversations within the family. And I think burden sharing, given the size of our debt, given the fact that the interest on our debt for the first time in American history is eclipsing our defense budget, will also be a key part. And when you're about to have the NATO summit this summer in Washington, and we're still at a paltry 11 out of 31 NATO nations just reaching the minimum, it's pathetic. We can't afford it anymore. They shouldn't be able to get away with it anymore. And I think the American people at a gut level are saying, wait a minute, why are you constantly asking me to dig deeper in my pockets? And European politicians don't have to dig deeper in theirs. And for the ones that are really paying attention, you're looking at allies like Japan that are responding to the threat and are increasing their defense budget. So I think the burden sharing conversation not only is is a nice to have. It with our fiscal situation, it's a must have. But you're right. We should all be articulating that as I think as tightly as possible. Finally, President Trump doesn't have to articulate some kind of pie in the sky vision. What he put forth with Robert O'Brien, with Mike Pompeo and the team around him worked. So it is a straight up comparison of what the world was like then and what it is like right now. And we're seeing an overwhelming amount of voters want to go back to what the safety and security they had just a few years ago.
Which is remarkable given the way that the media covers conservatives versus liberals, which is remarkable given what we've seen on college campuses. And, whatever the percentage is, 99% of the professors are liberal and conservative views get squashed. I mean, Alex Wong, again, I just want to go back to your campaign experience and the practicalities here of getting that message out. I mean, how do you do that when your normal channels are just all kind of stacked, closed really to you, to mix the metaphors?
Well, I actually think these campus protests are a point of contrast, an opportunity for contrast for President Trump and Republicans overall with the extremism on the left. And judging by the actions of President Biden coming out recently to put out statements on the protests, put out statements on anti-Semitism, he knows this is a political problem for him. Because the wider American people look at these protests, look at the anti-American statements, look at the pro-Hamas, pro-terrorism statements, the anti-Semitic statements, and they say that's not America. That is a fringe viewpoint, which gets too much truck, too much audience among the Democratic Party. And perhaps too late, President Biden understands that political liability. But this is a kind of a clarifying image for the American people of which party, which set of Americans, which values do they want to espouse? The ones that are pro-American, that stands up for our allies, that stands up for the Jewish people and against anti-Semitism, for peace through strength, or one of weakness, one of anti-Americanism. So I think this is a strong point of contrast, and I think that's coming out in the politics here on both sides.
Mary,
It's important.
One thought.
Please.
I want to follow up on Representative Waltz said. The primary tool for power in the Reagan administration and in the Trump administration both was the American economy, bar none.
That's right.
Bar none. And if you look at the failures of the Carter administration, now the Biden administration, look at the central undermining of American power and influence on the global stage. It is that you have a crappy American economy because you have a progressive set of policies that drive investment out and now create enormous risk. As Representative Waltz, enormous risk that debt to GDP now is 1, and that interest is going to exceed the defense. This is serious business. This will undermine the strength of the U.S. dollar. This will cause our allies to say, maybe we'll do that next deal in renminbi or some other currency, or they'll trade barrels of crude oil. The central thesis is when you have it right at home, when you start with deregulation, when you start with encouraging enterprise, how about just the simple statement of no, actually you did build it. And we want you to go build some more, right? These simple ideas that create the animal spirits and let us out innovate our adversaries are the things that are the principal thing that, as the Secretary of State, I went around the world and reminded people, you need our economy. This was, if you said, what's the one lever I had as the most powerful tool in my kit bag when I climbed off that beautiful white over blue airplane, it was the power of the American economy and the capacity to crush any economy, because we were going to out-innovate them, we were going to out-create them, and you were going to need to trade with the United States of America for your economy to be successful. That's the model we have to get back to. Then you can do the pure brass tacks security stuff you need. You can build the ships, you can build the submarines, you can put all kinds of small things underwater and do brilliant things in space. But without a GDP that is growing at a rate faster than the Iranians, which we failed to do in 2023, you are undermining the core thesis of how, from George Washington through Abraham Lincoln through Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, how America actually put its power on the world stage and caused people to want to be an ally of the United States of America.
It's such an important point and such a relevant point today, too, also because there's a conversation in the conservative movement about limited resources, and how do we take this static pie and how do we allocate it out? Gosh, maybe we should focus on China and we should get out of the Middle East. And what you're saying is we don't have to do that.
No, Mary, can I just, that was,
please, come on
that was
in,
brilliant.
please.
I wish I'd recorded that, Mike, because you're absolutely right. And the thing that is really causing my hair to turn whiter and driving me insane is that the underpinning of our true power, which is our economy, is energy and energy independence. And when I have lunch with the Speaker of the Parliament of Lithuania, literally right on the front lines, scared out of their mind, spending almost 5% now of their GDP on defense, and they buy 85% of their gas from Texas and Louisiana, that now has a ban on any future contracts. And she asked me, where am I supposed to go? I said, please get, I'm with you. Please drive down the street to the White House and make that very point. But, at the same time, we've had analyst after analyst, and including the intelligence community, validate that you drive the price of oil below $55 a barrel, and Putin is suddenly no longer able to fund his war machine. He's in economic survival mode. And so is Iran for that point. But I think back to the point of tonight's seminar in terms of how foreign policy affects politics, or vice versa, how domestic politics affects your foreign policy. I am now convinced, sitting on all three national security committees, the reason this White House is not enforcing the sanctions on Russia or Iran, for that matter, is because it would drive the price of gasoline here higher. And while we ban American gas and we have a war on American oil and gas, we allow our adversaries to flow for domestic political reasons and then essentially fund against ourselves in Ukraine and the Middle East. It's the most asinine, ridiculous thing I've ever seen. And our frustration is, we got that supplemental through, but the frustration is really through the roof.
Yeah, Mary, just jumping on what Mike Waltz and Mike Pompeo said, think about this. When the Biden administration came in, they took sanctions off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and said, Russia, you can supply oil to Western Europe. And then they sanctioned or stopped the production on the Keystone XL pipeline, which would bring, it's got about 25 miles left to go. It would bring 900,000 barrels of Canadian oil to Texas every year and get it refined in clean American refineries. Instead, the Canadians are going to have to build a pipeline to the West Coast and ship it, and if you care about the environment and dirty shipping, all the way to China to have it refined in Chinese refineries, strengthening the Chinese economy, but making the environment much dirtier. So, Nord Stream 2 is a go under Biden. Keystone Pipeline's a no under Biden. That just makes no sense at all. Our partners watch that, our adversaries watch it. And I'm the most optimistic guy about the future of America. I believe we're going to come back and we'll make America great again. But the way we're going to do it is with our entrepreneurs, is with the Elon Musks and the Peter Thiels and the Palmer Luckies. We were out of the space business, and Elon got us back into space, and Jeff Bezos got us back into space. It's the American entrepreneur, the American private sector that's going to make this country great and even solve our military problems. But if we overregulate them, if we pursue them for antitrust, if we raise taxes, we're going to kill the goose that could save America. And we need to get back in. And both Mike's make the right point. We need to get back in not only a peace of strength posture, but a pro-free enterprise, pro-capitalism posture in this country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ambassador. I just wish we could get Elon Musk out of China, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. You make a great point about big government. And actually, a very famous investor, Stan Druckenmiller, actually made this point this week. He said, if government just keeps spending money, they're going to crush one of the most innovative periods in the last 50, 100 years with the advent of AI, blockchain, all the biotech innovation that we're seeing right now. It's a golden age of entrepreneurship in America. You referenced space entrepreneurship. So it's ironic that at this point where we could have this new flourishing, a new step up in economic growth, where we seem to be stifling it. Gentlemen, I'm aware we've got 4 minutes left. We've got 4 people here on the seminar tonight. So I think I might just do a round robin and come to you with closing thoughts, starting with you, Alex Wong.
Right. Maybe I'll just reemphasize some point I made before, but I think it deserves reemphasis. The immediate struggle that we have, the immediate overarching competition that we have, and immediate adversary we have is the Communist Party of China. That's a conversation that should be occurring in politics, in elections, because that's a hard conversation with the American people of what major muscle movements on policy we need to make, possibly what sacrifices we need to ask the American people to make, and what's at stake. I'm not sure if President Biden has laid that out. I know President Trump has laid that out. Secretary of State Pompeo and Robert here laid that out when the Trump administration was in power. But that's a conversation that has to happen now. It has to happen in the future. And I think it'll be an overarching conversation for the politics of America.
Well said. And the emerging linkages between the Chinas, the Russias, the Iran, very disturbing. Congressman Waltz, over to you.
Well, you must have, you absolutely have to have in the next administration major, thoughtful, and effective investments into our industrial base. We literally no longer have the workforce, the steel, the aluminum, the shipyards, and really in some ways the know-how. If we wanted a Reagan-style naval buildup to deal with the threats that face us, we just don't have the industrial base to do it anymore. And so we can get back there. But, again, if you look at the bipartisan infrastructure deal, $1.2 trillion, not a single dollar went to our maritime industrial base, and we are a maritime nation facing two oceans. So this is top of mind. I'm releasing a maritime strategy this week. But look, Mike Pompeo said it best. It is our economy that powers our military. And when, to everyone's point on entrepreneurship, when I've seen the legislative text that would take capital gains to 44%, when I've seen the legislative text that would start taxing unrealized gains, or you'd have bureaucrats valuing your life before you realize any kind of liquidity. Everyone says it, but this is just a hugely, hugely consequential election for where the United States is going to go, and then our ability, regardless of our will, our ability to continue to lead the West and confront the greatest threat this nation's ever faced, which is the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you, Congressman. Ambassador O'Brien.
Well, Ronald Reagan asked that famous question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And the American people have to ask themselves, are they better off under President Biden with wars, a bad economy, inflation, people not being able to shop and get groceries for their kids and fill their gas tanks? Or are they better off under President Trump when there were no new wars? We had peace breaking out in the Middle East and Europe and Afghanistan, all over the world. Because we're President Trump, we talk a lot about America first, but a statement that he used to make constantly, and Mike and I, Pompeo and I both did, is that economic security is national security. And Mike made the case very brilliantly a few minutes ago. Economic security is national security. We had low gas prices, low inflation. People could go to the grocery store, they could buy homes. We were rebuilding our military. So ask yourselves, as the American people, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? If you think you are, vote for Joe Biden. If you think things have really deteriorated in our country, both overseas and at home, then vote to put President Trump back in office and bring a team of people with him that'll make America great again.
Thank you, Ambassador. Secretary Pompeo, please close us out.
Well, I know we've run the clock, but I hope everyone who's watching this takes away that the framing tonight has proven that it is seamless, that the capacity for the United States and our republic to regenerate, to have another 250 good years, depends on thoughtful leadership, unambiguously articulating a vision for America that is strong both home and abroad, and understands the connections between those two. When we get that right, and I'm convinced we will, we'll get another 250 great years.
Here's to that. Thanks to our co-chairs, our seminar members, the Nixon Foundation, and thanks to all of you for watching. That's it for this month's Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. We'll be back for our final seminar on June 4th, so join us for that. I'm Mary Kissel. Good night.